The morning sun painted the Afghan mountains gold as Captain Jake Reaper Morrison climbed into his A-10 Thunderbolt II. The aircraft's twin engines hummed with deadly precision, and the massive GAU-8 cannon jutted from its nose like a sleeping dragon. Jake had flown this same bird through 47 combat missions, each one bringing him closer to home. Today would be different. Slate 12, you're cleared for takeoff, crackled the radio from Bagram Air Base. Jake pushed the throttles forward, feeling the familiar surge of power as his Warthog rolled down the runway. Behind him, 3 other A-10s followed in formation. Slate's squadron was heading into the Kunar province, where Taliban forces had been moving weapons through mountain passes. The mission briefed simple enough. 4 A-10s would patrol the valley, provide close air support for ground troops, and return by sunset. Jake had done this dance 100 times before. His squadron mates, Captain Sarah Lightning Chen, Major Tom Bulldog Rodriguez, and Lieutenant Mark Rookie Peterson, were seasoned pilots who knew the terrain like their own backyards. As they crossed into hostile territory, the radio chatter remained routine. Ground controllers updated them on friendly positions while reconnaissance drones fed real-time intelligence about enemy movement. The Taliban had learned to fear the distinctive sound of A-10 engines. Local fighters called them deathbirds because once you heard that sound, it was often too late. Jake's targeting system locked onto a convoy of trucks moving through a narrow gorge. The vehicles had no business being in this remote area, and thermal imaging showed armed personnel. Slate lead to all units, Jake transmitted. I have eyes on possible hostile convoy. Request permission to engage. Permission granted, Slate lead. Clear to engage. Jake rolled into his attack dive, the familiar weight of G-forces pressing him into his seat. The A-10's cannon roared to life, sending depleted uranium rounds into the convoy below. Explosions bloomed orange against the brown mountainside as secondary detonations confirmed they had hit ammunition supplies. The other A-10s followed suit, methodically destroying the remaining vehicles. But something was wrong. As Jake pulled out of his dive, warning alarms screamed in his cockpit. Multiple surface-to-air missile launches appeared on his threat display. The Taliban had set a trap, using the convoy as bait to draw the squadron into a carefully prepared kill zone. SAM sites hidden in caves and behind rock formations lit up the sky with deadly trails of smoke. Slate squadron, break formation. Jake shouted into his radio. Multiple SAM launches. Evasive maneuvers. The 4 A-10s scattered like startled birds, each pilot fighting for survival as missiles streaked past their aircraft. Jake's training took over as he jinked left and right, deploying chaff and flares to confuse incoming rockets. The A-10 was built to survive ground fire, but sophisticated missiles were a different threat entirely. Lightning's voice cut through the radio static, strained with fear. Slate lead, I'm hit. Hydraulics are failing, and I'm losing altitude fast. Jake craned his neck to see Lightning's aircraft trailing smoke from her left engine. She was fighting to keep the damaged Warthog in the air, but the mountain peaks below offered no safe landing options. The terrain was nothing but jagged rocks and Taliban-controlled territory. Can you make it back to base? Jake asked, already knowing the answer. Negative. I'm going down somewhere in grid square 77 Alpha. Jake, tell my family. The radio went silent. Jake watched helplessly as Lightning's A-10 disappeared behind a ridgeline. No parachute, no emergency beacon, just silence where his friend's voice had been moments before. Rage and grief fought for control of his emotions, but training demanded focus. 3 aircraft remained, and they were still in the kill zone. Rookie's panicked voice broke through Jake's thoughts. Slate lead, Bulldog is hit. His bird is on fire. Jake turned to see Major Rodriguez's A-10 streaming flames from both engines. Bulldog was an 18-year veteran, a pilot who had survived Iraq and Afghanistan through skill and luck. But luck had just run out. The aircraft was falling like a burning meteor toward the valley floor. Bulldog, eject. Eject now. Jake screamed into his radio. The canopy blew off Rodriguez's aircraft, and the ejection seat fired. A parachute blossomed white against the blue sky as the burning A-10 crashed into a mountainside below. But Bulldog was alive, floating down toward Taliban territory where capture meant torture and death. Slate lead, what are our orders? Rookie asked, his voice cracking with stress. Jake's mind raced through options. Standard protocol called for immediate extraction to avoid further losses. But that meant abandoning Lightning and Bulldog to enemy forces. No pilot left behind was more than a motto, it was a sacred trust that bound military aviators together. Rookie, head back to base and report our situation. Tell them we need combat search and rescue immediately. What about you, sir? Jake was already turning his A-10 toward the crash sites, checking his fuel and ammunition levels. The aircraft's armor could withstand small arms fire, and he still had plenty of cannon rounds for ground support. Most importantly, he knew these mountains better than any Taliban fighter. I'm staying. Lightning and Bulldog are down there somewhere, and I'm not leaving them behind. Sir, that's suicide. The whole valley is crawling with hostiles. Jake switched his radio to the emergency frequency, hoping against hope that his downed squadron mates might hear him. Lightning, Bulldog, this is Reaper. If you can hear this transmission, stay hidden and stay alive. Help is coming. As Rookie's A-10 disappeared toward the horizon, Jake began his lonely vigil over the mountains. Below him, Taliban fighters were already moving toward the crash sites. He had perhaps 30 minutes of fuel for combat operations before he would be forced to return to base. 30 minutes to locate two downed pilots in terrain that had swallowed armies. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western peaks, painting the landscape in shades of gold and crimson. Somewhere in that maze of rocks and ravines, Lightning and Bulldog were fighting for survival. Jake's targeting system swept the ground below, searching for any sign of movement that might indicate friendly forces. His radio crackled with distant transmissions from Bagram Air Base. Search and rescue helicopters were being scrambled, but they would take at least 2 hours to reach the crash area. 2 hours was an eternity for downed pilots in enemy territory. Jake made a decision that would define the rest of his military career. He would remain on station, using his aircraft as a one-man shield between his friends and their enemies. The Taliban might control the ground, but the sky belonged to him. Banking his A-10 into a wide circle over the valley, Jake began the most important mission of his life. 2 pilots were counting on him, and failure was not an option. The mountains below held secrets and danger, but they also held his brothers in arms. As the first muzzle flashes appeared from Taliban positions below, Jake armed his weapons systems and prepared for battle. The real fight was just beginning, and he was outnumbered 1,000 to 1. But Captain Jake Morrison had not earned the call sign Reaper by backing down from impossible odds. The hunt for Slate 12 had begun. Captain Sarah Chen felt the world spinning as her parachute carried her toward the rocky ground below. Blood trickled from a cut above her right eye, and her left shoulder throbbed where shrapnel had torn through her flight suit. The ejection from her burning A-10 had saved her life, but now she faced a different kind of death sentence. The mountains of eastern Afghanistan stretched endlessly around her, their harsh beauty hiding countless Taliban fighters who would consider capturing an American pilot a prize worth dying for. Sarah had trained for this scenario, but no amount of survival school could prepare someone for the reality of being alone in enemy territory with minimal equipment and hostile forces closing in from all directions. Her boots hit the ground hard, sending jolts of pain through her injured shoulder. Training kicked in immediately as she gathered her parachute, burying the white silk under loose rocks to prevent enemy spotters from marking her position. The emergency radio clipped to her survival vest crackled with static, but she dared not transmit yet. Taliban forces monitored all frequencies, and a single radio call could bring dozens of fighters to her location. The crash site of her A-10 lay 300 meters away, marked by a column of black smoke rising into the clear mountain air. Sarah could see figures moving around the wreckage, Taliban fighters searching for anything useful among the twisted metal. They would find classified avionics equipment and weapons systems that could be sold to other terrorist groups or hostile nations. But, more importantly, they would know that the pilot had ejected successfully. Sarah pressed herself against a boulder as voices echoed across the valley. She couldn't understand the Pashto words, but the tone was clear enough, excitement mixed with determination. A hunting party was forming, and she was the prey. Her survival kit contained basic medical supplies, water purification tablets, emergency rations for 3 days, and a pistol with 2 magazines of ammunition. 46 rounds against an entire valley of enemy fighters. Moving carefully from rock to rock, Sarah began working her way up the mountainside. Higher ground would give her better radio reception and more options for hiding, but it also meant traveling through areas where the Taliban had operated freely for years. Every cave could hide enemy fighters, and every ridgeline might conceal snipers waiting for American aircraft. The sound of helicopter rotors echoed off the mountains, but these were not friendly birds. Soviet-era Mi-17 helicopters that the Taliban had captured from Afghan National Army units were spreading out across the valley, carrying reinforcements to search for the downed pilots. Sarah counted at least 4 aircraft, each capable of dropping a squad of fighters at strategic locations. As she climbed higher, Sarah's radio finally picked up a transmission that made her heart race with hope. "Lightning, Bulldog, this is Reaper. If you can hear this transmission, stay hidden and stay alive. Help is coming." Jake's voice was barely audible through the static, but those words meant everything to Sarah. Her squadron leader was still in the air, still fighting, and still looking out for his people. She pressed the transmit button twice quickly, a pre-arranged signal that would tell Jake she was alive without giving away her position to enemy monitoring equipment. Miles away on the opposite side of the valley, Major Tom Rodriguez was having his own nightmare. Bulldog's parachute landing had been rougher than lightning's. A sudden wind gust had driven him into a cluster of jagged rocks, and his left leg was clearly broken below the knee. The bone hadn't pierced the skin, but every movement sent waves of agony through his body. At 42 years old and with 18 years of military service, Tom knew that his survival would depend more on experience than physical capability. His crash site offered better concealment than Sarah's location. A narrow ravine cut between 2 steep ridges provided natural cover, and a small stream offered fresh water. But the broken leg meant that movement would be slow and extremely painful. Tom was essentially trapped in a natural foxhole, hoping that rescue would reach him before enemy forces did. Using his survival knife, Tom cut a branch from a stunted pine tree and fashioned a makeshift splint for his leg. The pain nearly caused him to lose consciousness, but he forced himself to stay alert. Voices were getting closer. Taliban search teams were systematically checking every possible hiding spot. Tom's radio crackled with Jake's transmission, followed by 2 quick clicks that could only be lightning confirming her survival. He pressed his own transmit button 3 times, their signal for wounded but mobile. The truth was that he could barely crawl, but admitting complete incapacitation would only force Jake to take greater risks in the rescue attempt. Above the valley, Captain Jake Morrison was fighting a different kind of battle. His fuel gauge showed less than 20 minutes of combat time remaining, but Taliban forces were moving closer to both crash sites with each passing minute. Intelligence reports from overhead drones painted a grim picture. At least 50 fighters were converging on the area where lightning had gone down, while another group was setting up blocking positions around Bulldog's location. Jake's cannon had already destroyed 2 Taliban vehicles that were racing toward lightning's position, but more kept appearing from hidden positions throughout the mountains. It was like fighting shadows. Every time he eliminated one threat, 2 more emerged from caves and behind rock formations. The radio crackled with an urgent transmission from Bagram Air Base. "Reaper, this is Base Command. Combat search and rescue is inbound, but they need you to mark the pickup zones and provide cover during extraction. Can you maintain station for another 40 minutes? Jake checked his fuel gauge again. 40 minutes was impossible with his current fuel load, but returning to base would leave his people defenseless against the closing Taliban forces. There was only one option that gave Lightning and Bulldog a chance at survival. "Base Command, I'm running low on fuel but will maintain station as long as possible. Be advised that hostile forces are moving rapidly toward both crash sites. CSAR birds will need heavy escort when they arrive." What Jake didn't mention was his backup plan. If fuel ran too low for a safe return to base, he would crash-land his A-10 in the valley and join the ground fight. The aircraft's 30mm cannon could be removed and used as a crew-served weapon, and Jake carried additional ammunition and supplies that could help all 3 pilots survive until rescue arrived. It was a desperate plan that violated every rule in the book, but desperate times called for desperate measures. Sarah had managed to climb nearly 500 feet up the mountainside when she heard the distinctive whine of Jake's A-10 engines overhead. Looking up, she could see the familiar twin-tailed silhouette circling protectively above the valley. Muzzle flashes from Jake's cannon lit up target areas where Taliban fighters were massing for their search operations. But she could also see something that Jake couldn't: a new threat approaching from the east. 3 additional helicopters were flying low between the mountain peaks, carrying what appeared to be a specialized Taliban unit. These fighters wore better equipment than the typical mountain fighters, and their helicopters showed signs of professional maintenance. Sarah's blood ran cold as she realized what she was seeing. Foreign fighters. Probably Pakistani ISI operatives or Arab mercenaries who specialized in capturing high-value targets like American pilots. These men would have training, sophisticated equipment, and orders to take prisoners rather than simply kill on sight. For Lightning and Bulldog, capture might be worse than death. Sarah grabbed her emergency radio and made a decision that could either save her squadron mates or doom them all. Reaper, Lightning. Be advised, multiple helicopters approaching from Grid 79 Charlie. These are not regular Taliban fighters. Repeat, specialized hostile units inbound to both crash sites. Jake's response was immediate and filled with grim determination. Copy, Lightning. I see them. Stay hidden and prepare for fireworks. High above the valley, Jake pushed his A-10 into a steep dive toward the incoming helicopters. His targeting computer locked onto the lead aircraft, and the cannon roared to life. The first helicopter exploded in a ball of flame and crashed into the mountainside, but the other 2 immediately took evasive action. The engagement was brutal and brief. Jake's superior firepower and armor gave him the advantage, but the helicopter pilots were skilled and desperate. Surface-to-air missiles launched from hidden ground positions forced Jake to break off his attack run just as he was lining up his second target. When the smoke cleared, 2 helicopters had escaped to land their specialized fighters in the valley below. Jake had bought time, but the most dangerous phase of the rescue operation was just beginning. On the ground, both Lightning and Bulldog could hear boots crunching on loose rocks as search teams spread out through the mountains. Professional voices called out instructions in accented English. These foreign fighters knew exactly what they were hunting for. The race between rescue and capture had begun, and time was running out for all 3 members of Slate's squadron. In less than an hour, the sun would begin setting behind the western peaks, and darkness would give every advantage to the hunters rather than the hunted. Jake's fuel gauge now showed 15 minutes of flight time remaining, but he could see the dust clouds of approaching rescue helicopters on the horizon. The next phase of the battle would determine whether 3 American pilots went home to their families or disappeared forever into the black holes of Taliban prisons. Either way, Jake Morrison was not giving up without a fight. The rescue helicopters appeared on the horizon like angels of salvation, but Captain Jake Morrison knew that salvation would come at a terrible price. 2 HH-60 Pave Hawks accompanied by a pair of Apache attack helicopters were racing toward the valley at maximum speed, but they were still 20 minutes away from reaching the crash sites. Jake's fuel gauge showed 8 minutes of flight time remaining. The mathematics of survival were brutally simple. Jake could either return to base immediately and leave his downed squadron mates defenseless against the closing Taliban forces, or he could make the ultimate sacrifice to buy them the time they needed to survive. There was really no choice at all. Base command, this is Reaper, Jake transmitted with steady calm. I'm going to be unable to return to base due to fuel constraints. We'll attempt controlled landing to provide ground support until CSAR arrives. The response was immediate and predictable. Negative, Reaper. Do not attempt landing in hostile territory. Return to base immediately. Jake was already scanning the valley floor for suitable landing sites. The A-10 Thunderbolt II was designed to operate from rough airstrips, and his aircraft could survive a landing on almost any reasonably flat surface. A dried riverbed about 2 miles from Lightning's position looked promising, long enough for landing, wide enough for the aircraft, and positioned to provide covering fire for both crash sites. Base command, my decision is final. Lightning and Bulldog need ground support, and I'm the only asset in position to provide it. Tell my wife that I love her, and tell my squadron that Slate 12 never leaves anyone behind." Jake switched off his radio before anyone could countermand his orders and began his approach to the riverbed. Landing a jet aircraft without a prepared runway was dangerous enough under ideal conditions, but doing it while under enemy fire in hostile territory was effectively suicide. But the A-10 had been designed by engineers who understood that sometimes pilots had to do impossible things to save their brothers in arms. On the mountainside above, Sarah Chen watched Jake's aircraft descend toward the valley floor with a mixture of admiration and horror. She understood what her squadron leader was sacrificing and why, but she also knew that his decision meant all three of them would now be trapped on the ground together. The rescue operation had just become infinitely more complicated. Sarah's radio crackled with Jake's voice, calm and professional despite the circumstances. "Lightning, Bulldog, this is Reaper. I'm coming down to join the party. Be ready to move to my position on my command." From his hidden position in the ravine, Major Tom Rodriguez felt his heart sink as he watched Jake's A-10 approach the valley floor. With his broken leg, Tom could barely crawl, much less make a rapid movement to a new position. But he also understood that Jake's sacrifice was their only hope of surviving until rescue arrived. "Reaper, Bulldog copies. Be advised that my mobility is severely limited, but I can provide covering fire from current position." Jake's A-10 touched down hard on the rocky riverbed, bouncing twice before settling into a controlled slide. Dust and gravel flew from the landing gear as the aircraft slowed, and Jake fought to keep the nose straight as loose rocks tried to grab his wheels. The landing was rough but successful. His aircraft was intact and positioned to support both crash sites. But success was measured in seconds, not minutes. Taliban fighters had been moving toward the valley floor throughout the afternoon, and Jake's dramatic landing had revealed his exact position to every hostile unit in the area. Muzzle flashes erupted from multiple directions as enemy fighters opened fire on the stationary aircraft. Jake had anticipated this moment during his descent. Instead of shutting down his engines, he kept them running at idle power while he rotated his aircraft to bring the nose cannon to bear on the nearest enemy positions. The 30mm GAU-8 cannon unleashed devastating firepower against Taliban fighters who had expected to capture or kill a helpless pilot. The psychological effect was even greater than the physical damage. Taliban fighters throughout the valley had learned to fear the sound of A-10 engines from above, but now the terrifying cannon was firing from ground level. Panic spread through enemy units as they realized that their prey had become a predator. But Jake's position was ultimately unsustainable. His aircraft was too large to hide and too valuable a target to ignore. Within minutes, Taliban commanders were repositioning heavy weapons to destroy the grounded A-10 and its pilot. Jake made another decision that defied all conventional wisdom. He shut down his engines, popped the canopy, and grabbed the portable radio and survival gear from his cockpit. If he was going to die in this valley, it would be on his feet with a rifle in his hands, not trapped inside a metal coffin waiting for a rocket-propelled grenade to end his story. The sound of Jake's boots hitting the ground echoed across the valley like a gunshot. 3 American pilots were now on the ground in Taliban territory, outnumbered 100 to 1, but still fighting. The odds were impossible, but the alternatives were unacceptable. Jake's radio crackled with an urgent transmission from the incoming rescue helicopters. "Reaper, this is Rescue 1. We are 15 minutes out from your position. Can you mark a landing zone for extraction?" Jake looked around the valley, quickly analyzing tactical options. The riverbed where he had landed was too exposed for helicopter operations, and both Lightning and Bulldog were positioned on mountainsides that helicopters couldn't safely approach. The rescue would require movement to a new location under enemy fire. "Rescue 1, current positions are not suitable for extraction. I'm going to consolidate my people at grid 78 Bravo, approximately 1 click north of my current position. Be advised that the entire valley is hot with multiple hostile units." What Jake didn't mention was that grid 78 Bravo was an exposed hilltop that offered good fields of fire but minimal cover. It was a place where 3 pilots could make a last stand, not a place where they could hide until rescue arrived. But it was the only location in the valley that helicopters could safely approach for extraction. Jake began moving toward Lightning's position, using his aircraft as cover from Taliban fighters who were converging on the riverbed. His survival rifle was a far cry from the massive cannon he had been wielding minutes earlier, but it was accurate and reliable. Every shot had to count because ammunition was limited and enemies were numerous. Sarah saw Jake moving up the mountainside toward her position and began her own movement to intercept him. Her injured shoulder made climbing difficult, but adrenaline and determination drove her forward. Taliban voices were getting closer, and she could see muzzle flashes from multiple directions as enemy fighters engaged Jake's position. Reaper, Lightning. I'm moving to your position from the north. Hostile forces are approximately 200 meters behind me and closing fast. Jake's response was punctuated by gunfire as he engaged Taliban fighters who were trying to flank his route. Copy, Lightning. Move fast and stay low. We need to reach Bulldog's position before the bad guys cut us off. The race across the mountainside became a running gunfight as Taliban forces attempted to surround the two pilots. Jake's superior marksmanship and Sarah's aggressive movement kept their pursuers at a distance, but ammunition was dwindling rapidly. Each shot had to disable an enemy fighter because there would be no second chances. Tom Rodriguez could hear the battle approaching his hidden position in the ravine. Despite his broken leg, he had managed to position himself behind a cluster of boulders that provided decent cover and good fields of fire. His survival rifle was loaded and ready, and he had a clear view of the route that Jake and Lightning would have to use to reach him. When Taliban fighters appeared on the ridgeline above the ravine, Tom opened fire with methodical precision. His first shot dropped the lead fighter, and his second scattered the rest of the unit back behind cover. Despite his injury, Bulldog was still a dangerous opponent for anyone foolish enough to underestimate him. Jake and Sarah reached Tom's position just as the sun began setting behind the western peaks. The three pilots quickly established a defensive perimeter among the rocks, with each person covering a different approach route. They had perhaps 10 minutes before full darkness, and the rescue helicopters were still 8 minutes away. Taliban forces were massing for a final assault on the ravine, and radio intercepts suggested that more enemy reinforcements were approaching from the north and east. The foreign fighters who had arrived earlier were directing the attack, and their professional tactics were evident in how quickly Taliban units were coordinating their movements. Jake's radio crackled with the voice of the rescue helicopter pilot. Reaper, Rescue 1. We have you on thermal imaging, and we can see multiple hostile units surrounding your position. Be advised that landing zone is extremely hot. Do you want us to wave off until air support can clear the area? Jake looked at his two wounded squadron mates and made the calculation that every military leader dreads. Waiting for additional air support would take at least 30 more minutes, but the Taliban assault would begin in less than 5. Waving off the rescue helicopters now would guarantee the death or capture of all 3 pilots. But bringing the helicopters into the valley under current conditions was asking the rescue crews to commit suicide in order to save 3 people who were probably doomed anyway. The decision should have been agonizing, but Jake's answer came without hesitation. 3 pilots had volunteered to serve their country, and now rescue crews were volunteering to risk their lives for the same cause. Honor demanded that each person be allowed to make their own choice about acceptable risk. Rescue 1, the landing zone will be hot, but we need immediate extraction. Taliban assault is imminent, and we cannot wait for additional air support. Copy, Reaper. We're coming in. Mark your position with strobes and prepare for immediate departure. Jake activated the emergency beacon on his survival radio while Sarah and Tom checked their remaining ammunition. Each pilot had less than 1 full magazine remaining, but that would have to be enough for whatever came next. In the distance, the sound of helicopter rotors was growing louder, racing against time and Taliban reinforcements in a final gamble that would determine the fate of Slate's squadron. The rescue operation had become a suicide mission, but sometimes suicide missions were the only way that heroes came home. The last stand was about to begin. The thunder of helicopter rotors filled the valley as Rescue 1 and its escort aircraft raced toward the surrounded pilots. Captain Jake Morrison watched the approaching aircraft through his night vision scope, knowing that the next few minutes would determine whether 3 families received their loved ones home or received folded flags instead. Taliban forces had surrounded the ravine where Jake, Sarah, and Tom had made their stand. Muzzle flashes erupted from dozens of positions as enemy fighters opened fire on the rescue helicopters. The distinctive crack of AK-47s mixed with the heavier boom of RPGs as Taliban commanders threw everything they had at the incoming aircraft. Rescue 1's pilot, Chief Warrant Officer Maria Santos, had flown extraction missions throughout Afghanistan and Iraq, but nothing had prepared her for the intensity of fire that erupted from the mountainsides. Her HH-60 Pave Hawk shuddered as bullets struck the armored hull, and warning lights illuminated across her instrument panel. Rescue 1 taking fire from multiple positions. Santos shouted into her radio. Apache escort, I need immediate suppression of hostile positions on the North Ridge. The 2 Apache attack helicopters immediately responded with devastating firepower. Hellfire missiles streaked toward Taliban positions while 30mm chain guns raked the mountainsides. Explosions lit up the darkness as enemy fighting positions were systematically destroyed, but more kept appearing from hidden caves and prepared bunkers. On the ground, Jake coordinated the final defense of their position while guiding the rescue helicopter toward the only suitable landing zone. Rescue 1, mark the strobes at my position. Landing zone is 20 meters south of the beacon, but be advised that approach from the east is under heavy fire. Santos banked her helicopter toward the landing zone, fighting crosswinds that threatened to slam her aircraft into the mountainside. Her crew chief, Sergeant First Class David Kim, had the rescue hoist ready and was scanning for hostile targets through his night vision equipment. Reaper, we've got eyes on your position, Santos transmitted. Prepare for immediate extraction. We can't hold this position long. The helicopter's rotor wash created a hurricane of dust and loose rocks as Santos brought her aircraft into a hover above the 3 pilots. But even as Kim lowered the rescue cable, Taliban fighters were advancing on the landing zone from multiple directions. The final assault had begun just as salvation arrived. Jake grabbed the rescue harness and quickly attached it to Tom Rodriguez, whose broken leg made him the most vulnerable member of their group. Bulldog goes first, then Lightning, then me. Make every shot count until we're all aboard. Tom was lifted into the helicopter just as the first Taliban fighters reached the edge of the landing zone. Sarah and Jake opened fire with their remaining ammunition, dropping 3 attackers but revealing their exact positions to other enemy units. Incoming fire intensified dramatically as Taliban forces realized how close they were to their prize. Sarah was next up on the cable, her injured shoulder screaming in agony as the rescue harness pulled her toward the helicopter. Below her, Jake fought alone against advancing Taliban forces, his rifle now empty and his sidearm down to its last few rounds. The mathematics of survival had become brutally simple: either the helicopter lifted him out in the next 30 seconds, or he would die fighting on the ground. But, as Sarah reached the helicopter cabin, disaster struck. An RPG fired from a concealed position struck Rescue 1's tail rotor, sending the aircraft spinning out of control. Santos fought desperately to maintain hover as hydraulic fluid sprayed from damaged lines and warning alarms screamed throughout the cockpit. The helicopter was dying, and everyone aboard knew it. Mayday, Mayday! Santos shouted. Rescue 1 is going down. All aircraft, we are going down hard. Jake watched in horror as the damaged helicopter struggled to maintain altitude. Sarah was hanging from the rescue cable, 20 feet below the aircraft and completely exposed to enemy fire. If the helicopter crashed, she would die on impact. If Santos tried to climb for altitude, Sarah would be dragged across the rocks. There was only one option left. Santos made a decision that would haunt her dreams for the rest of her life. She aimed her dying aircraft toward the least rocky area of the valley floor and prepared for a crash landing that might kill them all but offered their only chance of survival. Brace for impact, she screamed into her intercom. The helicopter hit the ground nose first, cartwheeling across the rocky terrain in a shower of sparks and twisted metal. The main rotor blades shattered against the mountainside while the fuselage broke apart under the tremendous impact forces. Miraculously, the fuel tanks did not explode, but the aircraft was completely destroyed. Jake ran toward the crash site, knowing that 5 more Americans now needed rescue instead of 3. The Taliban fighters who had been pursuing him were equally stunned by the helicopter crash, giving him precious seconds to reach the wreckage before enemy forces regrouped. Santos was unconscious but alive, held in her seat by her safety harness. Kim had been thrown clear during the crash and was crawling toward the wreckage despite obvious injuries to both legs. Sarah had somehow survived being dragged behind the helicopter during the crash, though her survival gear was torn and her injuries were severe. Tom Rodriguez, despite his broken leg, had retained enough presence of mind during the crash to grab the helicopter's survival radio. Now he was calling desperately for assistance while Jake and the wounded crew chief tried to extract Santos from the pilot's seat. Any station, this is Bulldog with emergency traffic. Rescue 1 is down in grid 78 Alpha. We have 5 souls requiring immediate medical evacuation. Multiple serious injuries and hostile forces closing on our position. The response came from Rescue 2, the backup helicopter that had been orbiting outside the valley during the first extraction attempt. Bulldog, this is Rescue 2. We copy your emergency traffic and are inbound to your position. Be advised that additional air support is 5 minutes behind us. Hold your position and prepare for extraction. But holding their position was easier said than done. Taliban forces were regrouping after the shock of the helicopter crash, and they could see that the Americans were now trapped in the open with multiple wounded personnel. This was their chance to capture or kill high-value prisoners, and they were not going to waste it. Jake had managed to extract Santos from the cockpit, but she was unconscious and bleeding from a serious head wound. Kim's legs were broken but he could still operate a rifle, while Tom's earlier injury had been aggravated by the crash impact. Sarah was the most mobile of the group, but she was operating on adrenaline and determination rather than actual physical capability. 5 wounded Americans with minimal ammunition were surrounded by dozens of Taliban fighters in terrain that offered no cover and no concealment. The odds were impossible, but giving up was not an option. Jake organized their defense with the tactical skill that had made him a squadron leader. Santos was positioned in the center of their makeshift perimeter, protected by the heaviest pieces of helicopter wreckage. Tom and Kim took positions that allowed them to provide covering fire despite their leg injuries, while Sarah and Jake prepared to fight off the final Taliban assault. The attack came from 3 directions simultaneously, with Taliban fighters using covering fire to advance from rock to rock toward the crash site. Jake's marksmanship was deadly accurate, but his ammunition was nearly exhausted. Each shot had to count because there would be no resupply and no retreat. Sarah fought with the desperate courage of someone who refused to be captured alive. Her rifle clicked empty during the firefight, and she drew her sidearm to continue the battle. Taliban fighters were now close enough that she could see their faces in the darkness, close enough to hear their voices as they coordinated their final assault. Just when the situation seemed hopeless, salvation arrived from an unexpected direction. Jake's abandoned A-10 Thunderbolt II, still sitting on the dried riverbed where he had landed hours earlier, suddenly roared to life. The twin engines spun up to full power as the aircraft began rolling across the rocky terrain toward the crash site. But there was no pilot in the cockpit. Rescue 2's crew chief, Master Sergeant Elena Vesquez, had rappelled down to Jake's aircraft during the firefight and managed to start the engines using emergency procedures. She couldn't fly the A-10, but she could use it as a 30-ton battering ram to break up the Taliban attack. The sight of an unmanned A-10 thundering across the valley floor toward their positions sent Taliban fighters scrambling for cover. Many of them believed they were seeing a ghost plane piloted by the spirit of a dead American warrior. Others simply recognized that being run down by a jet aircraft was not a death they wanted to experience. The psychological effect was devastating. Taliban units that had been advancing steadily toward the crash site suddenly broke contact and fled toward the mountainsides. The unmanned A-10 rolled to a stop between the American position and the nearest enemy fighters, providing both physical and psychological protection. Rescue 2 used this distraction to reach the crash site and begin loading wounded personnel. The extraction was rapid but chaotic, with helicopter crew members dragging injured Americans aboard while enemy fighters regrouped for another assault. Jake was the last person to board the rescue helicopter, just as he had been the last person to leave the fight above the valley. As Rescue 2 climbed toward safety, he looked down at his abandoned A-10 sitting alone on the valley floor. The aircraft had saved his life twice in one day, first by providing the firepower to protect his downed squadron mates, and then, by serving as an unmanned guardian angel during their final rescue. Taliban fighters would eventually reach the aircraft and strip it of anything valuable, but they would never understand the bond between a pilot and his machine. Jake had given up his aircraft to save his people, and somehow the machine had returned the favor. As the rescue helicopter cleared the mountain peaks and headed toward Bagram Air Base, Jake looked around at his wounded squadron mates and the helicopter crew who had risked everything to bring them home. Santos was still unconscious but stable, while Tom and Kim would require surgery for their broken bones. Sarah was exhausted but alert, her eyes reflecting the same mixture of relief and disbelief that Jake felt in his own heart. They had survived the impossible. 3 pilots had been shot down in enemy territory, surrounded by hostile forces, and abandoned with minimal equipment and ammunition. By every reasonable calculation, they should have died in those mountains or disappeared into Taliban prisons. Instead, they were going home. The rescue had cost them Jake's A-10 and Santos's helicopter, along with the careers of several people who had violated direct orders to save their fellow warriors. But every member of Slate's squadron was alive, and their families would not receive folded flags or missing in action notifications. As Jake watched the Afghan mountains fade into the darkness behind them, he thought about the radio transmission that had started this entire ordeal. "Forgot me" had been the Taliban's taunt, suggesting that American forces would abandon their people when the fighting became too difficult. They had been wrong. Slate 12 had proven that no one gets left behind, no matter what the cost or how impossible the odds. 3 pilots had been shot down, but 5 warriors had come home together. The ghost of Slate 12 would fly again.